You stepped onto a plane this week, buckled in, and covered 500 miles before you finished your coffee without your legs doing a single bit of the work. 200,000 years ago, that identical distance would have taken close to 3 weeks on foot through open country with no trail, no map, and no warning about what waited past the next ridge. For nearly the entire span of human existence, going anywhere at all meant real, constant risk, and your own two legs were the only vehicle you would ever own. Now you can cross an ocean before dinner. You can have a package shipped from another continent, and watching it land on your porch 2 days later feels almost boring. Distance has become so effortless that we barely register it as a thing that once mattered. But for roughly 300,000 years, every trip a human being ever made happened at exactly the speed of a walking body. And that single constraint quietly decided where we settled, who we met, what we ate, and how much of this planet any one person ever actually laid eyes on. So let's actually walk through how that constraint got solved, piece by piece, because the full sequence is more impressive than most people ever stop to consider. It starts with the human body itself, a machine that turned out to be uniquely built for one specific job, moving across enormous distances without stopping. From there, it becomes a story about crossing open ocean with nothing but a floating log, domesticating animals strong enough to carry us, and eventually inventing a piece of technology so obvious in hindsight that it is genuinely strange it took as long as it did to show up. Along the way, it also becomes a story about entire road networks engineered across continents thousands of years before modern surveying equipment existed, built by civilizations working independently on opposite sides of the planet and arriving at strikingly similar solutions to the exact same problem. None of this happened in a straight line, and none of it happened quickly. Every single advance sat unused for centuries before anyone figured out the next logical step, which makes the overall pace of the story almost as interesting as the individual breakthroughs themselves. If tracing a single human habit all the way from bare feet to jet engines is the kind of thing that keeps you watching, subscribing means you catch the next one of these the moment it goes up. Start with your feet, because they are stranger than most people ever give them credit for. Humans are excellent long-distance walkers, but genuinely mediocre sprinters. A cheetah can hit speeds no human will ever approach. A horse can hold a strong pace for miles without much strain. You, at your absolute best, might manage a brief sprint before your lungs give out. Raw speed was never the point of the human body, though. You can cover a solid 20 miles in a single day, sleep, and do the exact same thing again the next morning and the morning after that, for weeks on end if the situation demands it. Almost no other animal on the planet can sustain that. Your feet have natural arches that function like springs, and your Achilles tendon stores and releases energy with every single stride, sparing your muscles from carrying the full burden alone. There is a ligament running along the back of your neck that keeps your head steady while the rest of your body moves beneath it, and you carry roughly 2 million sweat glands cooling your skin, while nearly every other large mammal on open ground eventually has to stop and overheat. Your body was never built for speed. It was built to simply never stop moving. And that single design choice, endurance over acceleration, is arguably the reason every migration described later in this video was even physically possible in the first place. In the 1970s, the paleoanthropologist Mary Leakey uncovered a trail of footprints preserved in hardened volcanic ash at a site called Laetoli in Tanzania, dated to roughly 3.5 million years old. Two individuals, walking upright, side by side, the oldest confirmed evidence of bipedal walking ever discovered. Those footprints look remarkably close to your own. For millions of years afterward, upright walking remained the only transportation technology humans possessed, and somehow it still carried our species farther across the planet than any other creature has ever managed. No wheel, no boat, no domesticated animal of any kind, just legs and an unusual willingness to keep using them long after any sensible animal would have stopped. Starting roughly 70,000 years ago, humans began walking out of Africa, not as a single dramatic march, but as a slow accumulation of small groups, pushing a little farther into land nobody from our species had ever set foot on before. They crossed the Middle East, spread across Asia, reached Europe, pushed into Siberia, crossed into what is now Alaska, and continued south through the entirety of the Americas. An almost unimaginable total distance covered without ever knowing what, if anything, waited at the end of it. And this was not aimless wandering. Archaeologists have recovered volcanic glass tools hundreds of miles from the nearest source, ocean shells turning up deep inland, and traded goods that crossed entire mountain ranges. These groups were covering enormous distances with real purpose, connecting with other bands, chasing specific resources they already knew existed because word had reached them somehow. This was long distance networking on foot, not drifting. Some of these trade objects passed through dozens of hands before reaching their final resting place, meaning no single person necessarily walked the entire route themselves. Instead, goods and information moved in relays across overlapping social networks, each group carrying something a little farther before passing it on to neighbors they already knew and trusted, a system that extended the effective reach of any single community far beyond what its own members could physically walk in one lifetime. Modern genetics has actually given us a second, completely independent way to confirm all of this without relying on tools or footprints at all. Researchers studying mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down almost unchanged from mother to child across generations, have been able to trace the specific branching pattern of human migration out of Africa with remarkable precision, essentially reconstructing a family tree written directly into the cells of people alive today. That same genetic record has revealed something the sample evidence alone never could, that migrating humans encountered other human species along the way and did not simply pass them by. Genetic analysis has confirmed that modern humans interbred with both Neanderthals and a more mysterious relative called the Denisovans, meaning those ancient migration routes were not just successful journeys across land, they were points of direct contact between entirely separate branches of the human family, contact still detectable in the genome of most people living today. In other words, those long, slow migrations were not simply about arriving somewhere new. They were also, in a very literal biological sense, meetings, and the descendants of those meetings are reading this sentence right now. Walking handled land reasonably well, right up until a river got in the way. You can cross a desert on foot. You can climb over a mountain pass eventually. A river, though, simply stops you. And rivers cut through nearly every migration route, hunting ground, and trade path our ancestors ever relied on. For hundreds of thousands of years, a body of water functioned as a wall. You either found a shallow place to wade across or you turned back entirely. And then, somehow, humans figured out something no other land animal on Earth ever managed, deliberately crossing open water on purpose. In the early 2000s, archaeologists working on the island of Flores in Indonesia uncovered stone tools dated to roughly 800,000 years old. The trouble is that Flores has never once been physically connected to the mainland, even during the lowest sea levels of the deepest ice ages, meaning open ocean, at least a dozen miles of it, always separated that island from the nearest shore. Someone crossed that gap on purpose. We do not know exactly what they used to do it, since wood rots and reeds decompose, leaving no trace of the actual vessel behind. But the tools remain, and the tools alone prove the crossing happened. The very first boats were almost certainly accidental discoveries rather than deliberate designs. A fallen log grabbed midstream, a bundle of dried reeds lashed together out of necessity. Someone survived, floating across a stretch of water they never intended to cross, and that accident became a breakthrough. What came later, though, was fully deliberate. Around 65,000 years ago, humans crossed from Southeast Asia into Australia, a journey requiring at least 60 miles of completely open ocean. You cannot see Australia from the departure point. Nobody drifts there by pure accident across that much distance. Someone built a vessel capable of floating that far, aimed it toward water with no visible destination on the other side, and paddled anyway, with no way of confirming there was even land waiting at the far end. The oldest actual boat ever recovered is the Pesse canoe, found in the Netherlands, a simple, hollowed-out log roughly 10,000 years old. But the underlying technology clearly stretches back far earlier than that single surviving example. Since people were already living on islands, they had no possible way of reaching on foot tens of thousands of years before that particular canoe was ever carved. Then the Polynesians did something that still genuinely stuns modern navigators. Beginning roughly 3,000 years ago, Polynesian voyagers crossed the Pacific Ocean, the single largest body of water on the planet, using double-hulled canoes loaded with food, livestock, and entire extended families. They sailed for thousands of miles, guided by nothing but the position of the stars, the direction and rhythm of ocean swells, the flight patterns of seabirds, and subtle changes in cloud color near unseen land. There was no compass and no chart involved, just a formalized navigational system, sometimes called a star compass, built entirely around memorized rising and setting points on the horizon, passed down through oral tradition from one generation of navigators to the next, with extraordinary precision. They reached Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, and effectively every habitable island scattered across that entire ocean. Some individual voyages covered well over 2,000 miles of completely open water with no landmarks anywhere along the way. Modern sailors who have attempted to relearn and replicate this exact system, deliberately leaving behind every instrument, report that it takes years of dedicated practice simply to hold a heading using nothing but memorized star paths, which makes the original achievement even harder to casually dismiss. Add in the sheer logistics of the voyages themselves, transporting live pigs and chickens, cuttings of food plants meant to be replanted on arrival, and enough fresh water for a journey with no guaranteed resupply point, and the Pacific crossings start to look less like exploration and more like a fully planned, multi-generational colonization effort carried out entirely without writing anything down. Walking conquered land. Boats conquered water. But one problem remained fully unsolved: weight. You can walk 20 miles in a day, but you absolutely cannot walk 20 miles while carrying an animal carcass weighing several hundred pounds. For most of human history, the real limiting factor on transportation was never really distance. It was how much a single human body could physically carry. And that number tops out somewhere around 50 or 60 pounds before your own body starts breaking down under the strain. So humans began cheating that limit. The earliest method was straightforward dragging, killing something large, laying it across a hide, and hauling it back toward camp. We know this happened because archaeologists have identified specific wear patterns on ancient hides that only appear when something heavy has been dragged across the ground for a considerable distance. Eventually, someone improved on that idea directly, inventing the travois, two long poles lashed together into a V shape with a platform stretched between them. You drag the narrow end while the wide end carries the load, spreading the weight out efficiently enough that a single person could now move well over 100 pounds at once. The travois may be one of the oldest transportation devices our species ever invented, but since it was built entirely from wood and leather, almost none of the originals survived. We only know it existed at all because people were still actively using the exact same design when Europeans first encountered various indigenous groups across the Americas thousands of years later. The real breakthrough in moving serious weight, though, was not something you could build. It was something you could befriend. Roughly 15,000 years ago, humans domesticated dogs, our very first animal partnership, and one of the earliest jobs we assigned them was hauling weight. In Arctic regions, dogs pulled sleds directly across ice and snow, and a coordinated team of several dogs could move an entire family's camp in one trip. But dogs, however capable, are still relatively small. Something larger was needed. Roughly 5,500 years ago, on the open steppe of what is now Kazakhstan, humans domesticated the horse. We know this thanks to a culture called the Botai, whose archaeological remains include horse teeth showing wear patterns consistent with a bit, meaning something was regularly placed inside that animal's mouth for control, along with mare's milk residue baked directly into ancient pottery. These were not simply people who hunted horses occasionally. They rode them, milked them, and built entire lifeways directly around them. And the change in status a horse could bring to an individual rider was significant enough that horse burials, complete with bridal equipment, later became a marker of high standing across several steppe cultures that followed. And the horse changed absolutely everything. For roughly 300,000 years, the fastest a human being could reliably travel was ordinary walking speed. On horseback, that number multiplied dramatically. In a single generation, the entire human world effectively shrank. Trips that once took weeks suddenly took days. Messages traveled faster, trade networks stretched considerably farther, and warfare changed permanently, since an army mounted on horses could arrive before anyone even knew it was coming. Donkeys hauled cargo through deserts. Camels made crossing the Sahara possible. Reindeer pulled sleds through Arctic snowfields. Llamas carried loads over the high passes of the Andes. Wherever humans settled, they identified whatever animal fit the local terrain and put it directly to work. There was still one more major invention on the way, and it took an absurdly long time to actually arrive. Here is something that genuinely does not make sense until you sit with it for a moment. Humans had already crossed every ocean on Earth before anyone got around to inventing the wheel. The oldest confirmed wheel was recovered from the Ljubljana marshes in what is now Slovenia, dated to roughly 5,200 years old. Boats stretch back at least 10,000 years, probably considerably further. Horses were domesticated 5,500 years ago. Humans had already sailed all the way to Australia 65,000 years before that wheel was ever built. The wheel turns out to be one of the very last major transportation breakthroughs in this entire story. Not the first, and it did not even begin as a transportation device at all. The earliest wheels were built for pottery, a spinning disc used to shape wet clay evenly. At some point, someone looked at that spinning disc and had the idea to simply turn it on its side. What if something rode on top of it? The earliest wheeled vehicles were slow, heavy, and built from solid wood, prone to cracking on rough ground and sinking directly into mud. A horse pulling nothing at all was genuinely faster than a horse dragging one of those early carts. But around 2,000 years before the Common Era, someone worked out the spoked wheel, considerably lighter, stronger, and faster, which finally made real chariots possible, combining speed and cargo capacity in one vehicle for the first time. Paved roads followed shortly after. One of the earliest known paved roads was built in the city of around 4,000 years before the Common Era. Centuries later, Roman engineers took that basic concept and pushed it dramatically further, surveying routes with precise instruments, cutting consistent road grades through hills, building layered drainage systems beneath the surface to prevent flooding, and placing distance markers at regular intervals so travelers always knew exactly how far they had come and how far remained. Once wheels, roads, and domesticated animals were all working together as a single system, something resembling real infrastructure finally existed. Trade expanded dramatically. Large empires became genuinely possible to administer. Armies and supplies could move hundreds of miles without the entire operation collapsing under its own logistics. Halfway around the world, an entirely different civilization solved the same underlying problem without ever having access to the wheel at all. The Inca built a road network across the Andes Mountains known today as the Quapac Nan, stretching an almost unbelievable total distance across some of the most difficult terrain on the planet, cutting directly through steep mountain passes, coastal desert, and dense highland cloud forest. They never developed usable wheeled transportation, largely because the terrain made it impractical and because they lacked a suitable large draft animal, so instead they engineered the roads themselves around foot traffic and llama caravans, complete with rope suspension bridges swaying across deep canyon gorges, some of which were still in active use centuries after being built. Along these routes, the Inca maintained a relay running system, specially trained messengers who sprinted between small stations, spaced at set intervals, handing off both spoken messages and knotted cord records to the next runner in line. Using this method, a message could travel a genuinely staggering distance across the empire in only a matter of days, a communication speed that rivaled horseback messaging in parts of the world that had access to horses. The Inca proved that you did not strictly need the wheel to build a functioning transportation empire. You simply needed extraordinary engineering, disciplined organization, and, once again, a willingness to keep moving on foot far beyond what seems physically reasonable. So here is the complete picture. For roughly 300,000 years, humans had nothing but their own legs, and on those legs alone, they walked across the entire planet. When they hit water, they figured out how to float across it. When they needed to carry more than their bodies could handle, they learned to drag, then built frames to spread the load. Then they partnered with animals entirely. They mastered the horse, and the world abruptly got smaller. They invented the wheel, and it got smaller again. Every single one of those breakthroughs took thousands of years to arrive, and everyone was built directly on top of whatever came immediately before it, quietly solving problems that would have seemed genuinely impossible to anyone living just a few generations earlier. Now you sit inside a climate-controlled metal box, moving at highway speed, and casually call it a commute. You cross an entire ocean in a matter of hours and feel mildly annoyed that the in-flight internet is running slow. You carry a device in your pocket capable of summoning a car directly to your exact location within minutes, and you feel irritated when it takes slightly longer than expected. None of that irritation would have made any sense at all to someone whose entire understanding of travel was built around walking, floating, dragging, and eventually riding. One incremental improvement at a time, across a span of time longer than most of us can genuinely picture. Your ancestors walked barefoot across thousands of miles of unnamed continents to reach places they had never seen and could not have described. They did it because stopping meant dying, plainly and simply. We solved the problem of distance so thoroughly that we eventually forgot it had ever been a problem at all. Every highway, every airport runway, every mile of train track on this planet exists today because, roughly 300,000 years ago, someone looked toward a distant horizon and simply started walking. They had no idea what waited at the end of that walk. They went anyway. Every canoe pointed at empty ocean, every relay runner sprinting between mountain stations, every rider pushing a horse across open steppe, all of it traces back to that same original decision, made over and over again by people with no way of knowing whether it would actually work. And that, more than almost anything else, is the most human thing there is.